So, today I want to talk about the difference between the left and the right. After recent events and the way things have transpired, I think it's really important to analyze the difference in the way that the left and the right has a tendency to look at the world. I've seen a lot of bizarre perspectives manifest, both before and especially now after the way recent events have transpired in the Capitol. And I just want to address the full political spectrum from very different positions on how to take this information. From the left, if you're a leftist and you're someone who's been really frustrated and very much, wanting the change and revolution to happen, and maybe has had some desire to manifest something like what the right has done, I'm going to ask you just not to glorify what they did because, tactically speaking, they are vastly different than what we aspired to be and what we need to do if we are to ever actually create change in this country or the world. If you're someone from the center or center right, I've heard a lot of the perspectives that the left, the far left, and the far right are just identical perspectives. And I am going to try to explain to you why we are not and why our perspectives have always been vastly different. And if you're someone on the right who's coming across this and is coming from that perspective that I've seen that Antifa and BLM were actually the real people who infiltrated the Capitol, I think you just need to take account of yourself and look at the bias that you've come into and just try to look at yourself and analyze yourself as a movement and where you found yourself on the political spectrum in terms of being that far right and borderline fascist, honestly. Um, so there is a theory, in a political theory that basically the left and right are always identical. It's called horseshoe theory, and I don't ascribe to it at all. It's the idea that when you move across the spectrum, it's not really going straight line across the board, but bends like a horseshoe, and that the left and right tend to approach each other. And that comes from a certain historical analysis that's kind of beyond the scope of this, and I don't want to bog ourselves down with all of that. What I want to look at is from the modern perspective and in generalizations, what the left and right have a tendency to look at and expect from the world around them. So, the one area where the left and right do agree is that the status quo is in fact a problem, that there is a general issue going on in society. The problem is that the left and right disagree in just about every other component besides that. We disagree in approach, we disagree in moral compass, we disagree in tactics, and we disagree in how we value and see each other within our own movement. And if there's anything to take away between the difference between the left and the right, it's the difference between nuance and action. The left analyzes the world through nuance, and the right, reacts to it with action. The right has a tendency to have these very vague goals that can often be contradictory and don't always have some sort of strict understanding to them. For example, when the right took over the Capitol, a lot of them probably walked into that building with some sort of vague understanding of what they wanted. But there was no unification, there was no um, actual understanding of what they were actually trying to accomplish there or what they wanted to set on the table. And I think that's why it was so easy to remove them from that position and to push them aside and get them out of the Capitol building. You know, I know there were some people who walked in with probably the idea of maybe taking hostages or maybe some sort of, armed glorious thing and to be a hero. But they didn't really have the cohesion to do anything about that or to make that happen. And it's these very vague goals that are just action oriented. You act first and then try to justify it later. You try to justify your positions after the fact. In fact, it's this position that actually weirdly makes the right look very unified and really drawn together, even though they're not, because when they just act first, they have a tendency to look like they have this very, very, very unified force. They all marched in and they all rushed in. But again, it pitters out very quickly once they realize that they're not really sure why they're doing what they're doing and all the contradictory things come together. And it really speaks to an anti-intellectualism. And if you want to learn more about that and that very fascist perspective and what makes a fascist movement like that, I definitely recommend my video on the 14 points of fascism, and I'll link that in the description down below. The left, however, approaches the world through nuance. We are the people who have to talk theory, tactics, and talk about how to keep our people safe and bring our communities together. And when we do this, we are always discussing the little details. We are the people that if this had happened in reverse, we would have been the ones being like, well, are there sleeping bags? Are there enough food and resources? What are our goals moving into this? What do we want to see accomplished? What is our purpose? And even if that differs from person to person, there's generalities that we're able to, fall behind. And technically speaking, we have a general trend in what we want to see happen because we've discussed this ahead of time and we speak about tactics. And sometimes when the left looks very disjointed, the reason for that is because of this. We have a tension because we have different perspectives on how we should best take care of ourselves and make the society better. And, this occasionally reaches a small level of egoism, but for the most part isn't meant to be from this very egotistical perspective, but rather generally believing that one set of tactics is better than another. And in a society that values individualism, a society that values, certain belief systems in the status quo, the left is forced to analyze ourselves as well, to take a look and examine ourselves as part of that status quo, as how we need to grow, how we need to take on and learn new perspectives. And the right tends to be very critical of that. They tend to say, I'm right, I know I'm right, and if anyone disagrees, forget them. So that's kind of where the two sides tend to look at the world and, the activism that they're trying to create and the changes they're trying to bring. Again, the left is nuance and the right is action oriented without necessarily thinking. So I want to bring up something that requires me to talk about the center for just a moment. The center has this tendency to believe that it is, centered, that it is not extreme, that it is somehow, this understanding that, removes all of the problems of both the left and the right. And I need to speak to this in particular. The center tends to dislike the left because it calls them out on certain things, and it actually ends up enabling the right by giving them a lot of voice and power. Because when the left and right go into conflict with one another, one of the things that always comes up is free speech. And the right will talk about how they have a right to say everything they want to say, and the left will talk about and try to say, no, actually the things you're saying are really harmful and violent. What we saw transpire is a product of when that level of speech and violence is left completely unchecked. The right has a tendency to use speech and to use their rights to speak in such a way as to talk about the lack of freedom for other people. They hearken back to the past. They want to come back to a place where everything was great. Does that sound familiar? Make America Great Again? It's this idea that in the past there was something utopian, something ideal, some universal truth that they are trying to reach. They speak through xenophobia, they attack outgroups, and they tend to steal power in this very zero-sum game gain understanding that if other groups get power, if other groups that have different views from them get power, that it'll somehow take away their rights, their ability to be in charge, their ability to control the narrative. Generally speaking, you see perspectives where it'll be something like, well, if a gay person has a right to say to marriage, it'll somehow reduce my marriage. You'll see perspectives like if a person of color moves into the suburbs, it'll damage the suburbs somehow in this very, permanent way. The whole understanding is that a person having equality ends up taking away their power. because they look at the world in hierarchy. And so everything is about maintaining power and strength and hearkening to times when they had more strength. The left, on the other hand, has a tendency to want to democratize freedom, to bring it to as many people as possible. And a lot of the movements historically have been co-opted by people who were more egotistical and more designed on making it a cult of personality. But generally speaking, what leftists do want is equality across the board. When we're responding to the right and talking about hate speech and how that needs to be shut down, when we're talking about being anti-fascist, what we're speaking to is the ability to let other people flourish and exist. We want people of color to have equality of opportunity, to not see themselves under the boot and oppression of police. We are speaking out against systems that are not working for people. And so when we imagine the world, we're trying to not hearken to a past that is perfect and that utopia. We're trying to bring ourselves to imagine a better future. We're talking about a world with healthcare, where nobody's living on the street, where nobody's starving, where, again, we make sure everybody has equality of opportunity, and we're imagining a world where people are free to move and not just property. The left wants to make sure and uphold people first. We want to uphold the rights of people and humans to be able to experience more of life and to create that better future. So the left takes this perspective where it seeks to learn more about other people, where it constantly calls itself into question, where it constantly is reanalyzing itself and regrowing itself in a way to try to become better. It's why the left has adopted a lot of the social justice stances. It's why the left has taken on a lot of the perspectives of wanting, like things I mentioned before, healthcare and rights for people. The right, however, tends to shun this. It speaks to the idea that everyone has already created the best form of humanity, and we need to speak to it and keep it in its place. And I'd even say that the left has to learn its enemy better than the right has to learn about itself. The tactics that the right use, the tactics that the right use are often not fully understood by them, but yet the left seems to be the ones who are sitting there and analyzing, what does fascism look like? What are they trying to accomplish? What are their goals? And the right, instead, when responding to the left or reacting to the left, has a tendency to just use buzzwords. They're socialists, they're this, they're that, they're the other thing. And they don't actually look at the nuance of what that's supposed to represent and what the end goals of those are, even if they have, not always reached their goals and conclusions all the time. Especially when groups on the right have constantly been fighting and agitating against that. Another point that I'd like to bring up is the way that we organize differently. The left tends to be a community of people, of humans, coming together and banding together under the same understanding. The idea that you might want to think of is that the left is a bunch of individuals, a bunch of people who see a similar future, a similar ideology, a similar goal, and want to strive for that. When people say that Antifa is a movement and not an organization, this is what they're saying, that it's an ideology. It's this perspective that you're trying to create a certain thought and band together to make that thought happen. So you see a lot of people talk about, again, tactics when they're protesting of how do we take care of each other? How do we maintain ourselves? How do we protect ourselves? How do we protect the community? How do we make sure our end goals are achieved? Because our end goals are to make sure people have rights. On the right, you tend to see what I would call the hierarchy of heroes. You have a bunch of people who come out and glorify a certain type of hierarchy, dominance, and violence. If you look at the way the Proud Boys organize and structure themselves, in order to get to a certain position in the Proud Boys, you have to fight somebody. When they go through their initiation rituals, they have a tendency to focus on punching and hitting each other while trying to recite things to numb themselves to a certain level of violence. They are trying to enforce certain standards of strength and hierarchy and in this very violent overtone. And again, the left is the intellectual group who wants to speak about theory and nuance and details. And so when you have this hierarchy of heroes, you end up with someone on top, but there's always somebody else who wants to be there. Everyone else wants to take control. Everyone else wants to make a name for themselves. And so they actually are much less unified in how they view each other and see each other. It's very difficult for them to come together and band together in this way because, again, even though they look it because they've rushed into a situation, they really all have differing goals and they don't really agree with much. But that contradiction is the basis of fascism and right-wing organizing, if you can even call it that. And again, they are actually an organization, as opposed to the left, which is, an ideology. And so I want to take two examples that exist within our society that have often, been positions that some people have said that the left and right do agree on, and just kind of analyze everything I've said from those two. And those two are an examination of violence and using it as a tactic, and the understanding of how we examine media. And I'll probably just conclude on all of that. So, for example, with violence, when two groups go out in the street to protest and violence is used, the right again has a tendency to glorify it. Like I said before, you'll hear things like a call for execution, saying this particular group of lives doesn't matter. They'll say things like, punitive justice is good. We need to attack. We need to be violent. It's the stuff I also mentioned about the Proud Boys and initiation. It's a toughness tactic. They want to prove that they are strong by committing acts of violence. And they'll often make displays and go out with guns, guns out. And it's very much an aesthetics thing where they want to show strength. Strength is the force they are trying to adhere to. It's not about, again, the nuance and all the other stuff. They want to make themselves known. And they'll claim things like, oh, we're upholding something or we're trying to protect something. But in general, they're the ones seeking to create a very violent scenario. On the flip side, the left has a tendency to use violence as a tool. It isn't wielded like as a generality, like I'm going to just attack whoever I can get my hands on, like the right does. It's specifically targeted. And it's targeted in a way as to make voices that are not heard, heard. Because oftentimes, a lot of the issues under the status quo in society are not heard until some sort of violence does come out. And so the weird perspective is that the violence of the left is designed to raise people's voices and make them heard when they are often not and when they are misrepresented and pushed aside. And it is a response to a very systemic form of violence. It's a response to, again, this idea that people have no other way to express this. They've run out of options of using nonviolent approaches. And oftentimes we'll be the first ones to say that the loss of life, even committed by our own people, is a tragedy and something to be avoided at all costs, even though we accept the reality that sometimes it is useful and does create this very strong position to make people aware of just how bad things have gotten. And again, it's typically targeted. It's typically aimed at a specific goal. And when the left can, it prioritizes property being destroyed over violence. It's, and the media often conflates the two. They talk about, oh, the burning of a building is violent and it's all this other stuff. But no, the burning of the building is a symbol. It's a representation of something. Its ability to avoid actually causing harm to an individual. No people die when a building is set on fire in particular, right? Like, no people are being actively killed when a statue is being torn down. When a right-wing person goes into a, church or goes into another organization and shoots people, they die. That's a loss of life. That is a loss of actual valuable perspectives that are being destroyed. And this is kind of the difference. And it's conflated as quite the same when it really isn't. And we need to take account for that and address that. So that's kind of the perspective of violence that the two groups look at. And again, the left regrets it usually, right? Like we're not out to do it. The right glorifies it. And so now looking at the media, both the right and the left have very valid criticisms of media. Media is flawed. But the right tends to just espouse things like it's fake news, and again appeals to that anti-intellectualism that we talked about. They repeat and parrot certain points and perspectives that have been put out there. Anybody that disagrees with them is able to be, able to be ignored and pushed to the side. Well, that person disagrees with me. I'm right. I'm justified in my position. So I'm going to ignore all the critical thinking. I'm going to ignore all the evidence to the contrary. I'm going to say that my beliefs are right, and that must be fake news. That is the right-wing perspective, and that's not a valid way of looking and analyzing at things. You can call a lot of things into question, but you need to start looking at evidence and start looking at the plausibility of theories and whether or not the number of people involved in it are actually viable. And again, all these contrarian positions are equivalent to either an enemy that hasn't come to the right, perspective. Either they're a lost soul or they're strictly an enemy that has, created and propagated some sort of leftist understanding or propaganda that is speaking out against the actual reality. And so it creates this entire alternative fascist, fictional universe. Think of QAnon and the way that that's all functioned to justify the positions that they're in. And eventually they all have to have the wake-up call. And hopefully it's not too late. When the left has a tendency to critique media, we tend to do it by analyzing and understanding that the media is controlled in such a way by financial people who buy and sell information. That consent is often manufactured, and especially right-wing media is put out there to create propaganda, but even some of the centrist media ends up with a perspective where they use language and ideologies that prop up certain financial institutions and make other groups look bad. It's been very strange, very much with this capital situation, to finally hear language like insurrectionists being used by some of the media, but they're still calling some of the right-wing group protesters. Meanwhile, they want to call the left-wing groups, looters and rioters. The level of violence and the level of desire for violence is vastly different, but they're not calling it what it is. And so it creates this illusion and bubble that the left is one thing when the right, when the right thing is actually, It creates this illusion that the left is one thing and the right is another when they're actually not. When we talk about police violence, when we talk about these situations, we're often talking about the fact that everything is biased in the direction of center right. When the left is trying to create actual good change for people on the ground and break down a lot of the financial institutions that are in place to distribute things to more people. That is the key difference when you're analyzing both of these perspectives. So generally speaking, I think the right in general has a vague understanding that there's something wrong, but they misattribute their lack of power, their lack of position, and their lack of status to the fact that other people are stealing it from them. Whereas the left has a tendency to try to protect people's rights and see it as trying to expand that to more people in general and to try to, take that power back from people who actually have concentrated it in capital and in a lot of institutions that steal the ability for people to actually live the best lives they could be having right now. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. That said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.